For thousands of years, it's been one of the world's great mysteries. Just how were the pyramids built so deep in the Egyptian desert?
For more than 4,000 years, one structure has refused to sit quietly in the history books. It rises out of the Giza plateau like something the desert itself decided to grow. And no matter how many times archaeologists close the file on it, the questions come back. So somebody tried a different approach. Instead of asking a historian, they asked a machine. They fed Grok, the AI system built by XAI, a mountain of raw survey data on the Great Pyramid, laser scans, satellite readings, engineering tolerances, astronomical alignments, and gave it one instruction: forget the textbook and tell us only what the numbers themselves are saying. What came back wasn't a name, a date, or a confirmed conspiracy. It was a list of measurements that refused to behave the way a Bronze Age monument is supposed to behave. And once you sit with those numbers, it's hard to unsee them. Let's start with the story most of us already know, because it deserves to be told honestly before anyone starts poking holes in it. Around 2560 BCE, during Egypt's 4th dynasty, the pharaoh Khufu commissioned a tomb worthy of a god-king. Over roughly 2 decades, organized crews, not chained slaves, but paid and fed laborers, quarried limestone from the plateau itself, floated finer stone down the Nile on barges, and dragged the blocks across wetted sand using little more than wooden sledges, rope, and sheer coordinated effort. Their instruments were almost embarrassingly simple: knotted cords for measuring distance, plumb bobs for finding true vertical, wooden set squares for right angles, and shallow troughs of water for finding a level line. That's the entire toolkit history credits them with. And the evidence for this version of events is real. It's not speculation dressed up as fact. Archaeologists have excavated an entire workers' town at Giza, complete with bakeries, breweries, and barracks. They found skeletons with healed fractures, meaning injured laborers were cared for rather than discarded. There are administrative papyri that log the daily movement of stone, and there are quarry marks, actual graffiti, left by work gangs with names like Friends of Khufu, painted proudly in red ochre on blocks nobody was ever meant to see again. This was a workforce with identity, with pride, with a stake in what they were building. So when someone tells you the pyramid is an unsolved mystery, understand that mainstream archaeology already has a coherent, well-evidenced answer for who built it and roughly how. That part isn't really in dispute. What the standard story struggles with isn't the labor. It's the precision. And that's exactly the gap Grok was pointed at. The first number worth sitting with is the base. The Great Pyramid's footprint spans more than 230 meters on each side, an area you could lay several football fields across. And by every survey ever taken, that entire base is level to within a few centimeters across its whole span. Picture a pane of glass the size of a city block, where the highest and lowest points differ by less than the width of 2 fingers. Now imagine building that not as a single poured surface, but out of millions of individual stone blocks, some weighing as much as a delivery truck, each one trimmed and seated by hand, using nothing but water troughs and wooden squares under a blazing desert sun. When Grok was asked to estimate the statistical likelihood of a crew achieving and holding that tolerance across such a distance with only Bronze Age tools, its answer wasn't impossible. It was careful never to claim that, but it did flag the result as improbable in a way that should give anyone pause. Modern building codes for a skyscraper's foundation slab often allow more slope than what's baked into a 4,000-year-old tomb. Then there's the orientation. The 4 sides of the pyramid don't just point roughly toward the compass directions. They're aligned to true north, true south, true east, and true west with an error measured in mere arc minutes, fractions of a single degree. That's not something you eyeball. True north isn't even where a compass points. Magnetic north wanders, drifts, and has nothing to do with the planet's actual rotational axis. To find true north without instruments, you have to track the stars themselves across an entire night, locate the still point they all seem to wheel around, and then translate that invisible celestial point into a straight line scratched across hundreds of meters of construction site, without letting it drift by even a hair. Do that under open sky, with nothing but patience and observation, and you've done something modern engineers still respect. A tomb doesn't need this kind of alignment. A funerary monument gains nothing ceremonially from pointing at the exact rotational axis of the Earth. And yet here it is, aimed with a precision that overshoots every practical explanation anyone has offered. The numbers get stranger the deeper you go. Take the perimeter of the pyramid's base and divide it by its original height, the height it had before the outer casing stones and capstone were lost to time and looting. The result lands remarkably close to 2 pi. That's not a coincidence historians dismiss lightly, but it does have a fairly mundane potential explanation. If the ancient builders measured horizontal distances by rolling a drum and counting rotations, and measured vertical height using stacked cubit rods, pi can sneak into the relationship almost by accident, a byproduct of using a circular tool to measure straight lines. It's elegant, and on its own, it's explainable. The golden ratio is a harder pill to swallow. Phi, roughly 1.618, is the proportion found in nautilus shells, sunflower seed spirals, and tree branching patterns, a number our eyes are drawn to without knowing why. As far as the written historical record goes, no one formally described phi as a mathematical constant until Greek geometers did centuries later, over 2,000 years after the last stone was set at Giza. There's no equivalent measuring wheel explanation for phi the way there is for pi. It has to be deliberately understood and calculated to end up encoded in the relationship between a structure's height and the slope of its faces. And by several measurements, that's exactly where it appears. Whether that's true intent, a happy numerical accident buried in choices made for other reasons, or an artifact of which specific measurements get selected for comparison is genuinely disputed. But it's the kind of detail that turns a curiosity into a real question. Then comes the biggest and shakiest claim of all, the one that draws the most pushback and deserves it. Multiply the pyramid's original height by 43,200, and the result approximates the Earth's polar radius. Multiply the base perimeter by the same number, and you land near the planet's circumference. The number 43,200 isn't arbitrary either. It's the number of seconds in 12 hours, tied to the Earth's own rotation. Proponents of this idea argue it means the structure encodes the scale of the planet itself, built by people who somehow knew the Earth's true dimensions millennia before anyone else recorded them. It's a striking pattern. It's also the kind of pattern that critics rightly point out can be manufactured almost anywhere. Give someone a large, precisely built structure, a known set of planetary dimensions, and total freedom to choose a multiplier and a rounding threshold, and matches like this tend to appear whether or not anyone intended them. Mathematicians have demonstrated similar hidden ratios in ordinary modern buildings using the same method. This is the weakest thread in the whole pile, and it should be treated as a provocative curiosity rather than evidence. So where does that leave things? Not with aliens, not with sunken continents, and not with certainty in either direction. What the exercise actually produced was a pattern of unresolved tension, a floor leveled beyond any practical necessity, an alignment accurate enough to embarrass some modern instruments, a mathematical relationship that shouldn't have existed on paper for another 2,000 years, and a planetary correlation that's compelling right up until you remember how easily coincidences like it can be constructed after the fact. Individually, defenders of the standard narrative have reasonable rebuttals for almost every single one of these. Stacked together, the rebuttals start to feel like they're doing a lot of individual work to explain away a pattern that keeps showing up anyway. There's one more detail worth sitting with, buried deep inside the structure rather than on its surface. Above the king's chamber, engineers have long documented a series of stacked granite relieving chambers, hollow spaces built one above another, designed to redirect the crushing weight of the mountain above away from the room below. Some of the massive granite beams inside are cracked, likely from the stress of construction or an early seismic event. And yet the ceiling has never collapsed. The damage was absorbed, distributed, and contained by a design that anticipated failure before it happened. That's not a detail you get from trial and error alone. That's the signature of people who understood how force moves through stone well enough to plan for stone breaking, on the very first attempt at a structure this ambitious, at a point in the timeline where that level of engineering foresight isn't supposed to exist yet. There's also the older Messier argument surrounding the Sphinx, sitting just a short walk from the pyramid's base. Some geologists point to deep vertical weathering grooves on its enclosure walls and argue they look like the kind of erosion caused by sustained heavy rainfall, a climate pattern the Giza Plateau hasn't experienced since long before the dynastic era began. Other geologists disagree entirely, attributing the same grooves to wind, sand, and mineral weathering over thousands of years, processes that don't require rethinking the timeline at all. It's a genuinely contested reading, not a settled fact, and it would be dishonest to present it as anything more solid than that. But it's worth mentioning because it sits on the same pile as everything else here. Another data point that refuses to resolve cleanly in either direction. Another reason serious researchers keep circling back to a plateau most people assume has already given up all its secrets. When you lay every one of these threads side by side, for broad possibilities tend to surface, and none of them can be fully ruled out by the measurements alone. The first is that ancient Egyptian engineers possessed a level of applied mathematics and surveying skill far beyond what the surviving written record suggests, knowledge that was practiced but never fully documented, and eventually faded as techniques changed. The second is that this knowledge wasn't developed by the Fourth Dynasty at all, but inherited from an earlier culture whose own history simply didn't survive into the archaeological record we've recovered. The third, more speculative option points toward the catastrophic climate shifts at the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, and asks whether refugees from an older, more advanced society could have carried fragments of mathematical knowledge into the cultures that came after them, planting seeds that eventually flowered at Giza. The fourth option is the one that gets the most attention online and the least support anywhere else, that the knowledge embedded in the structure didn't originate from any human culture at all. Grok, when pushed on this in the original exercise, treated the first three as live possibilities worth investigating, and the fourth as something the data didn't rule out but also didn't remotely establish. That distinction matters. Refusing to dismiss a possibility outright isn't the same as endorsing it. None of this proves a lost civilization, a forgotten branch of Egyptian science, or anything beyond human capability. What it does is something quieter and, in a way, more interesting. It shows that when you strip away the comforting narrative and just look at the raw numbers, the standard explanation doesn't fully close the gap. It explains who moved the stones and why they were motivated to do it. It has a much harder time explaining how those stones ended up leveled, aligned, and proportioned to standards we associate with satellites and laser transits, rather than copper chisels and wooden squares. Maybe the answer really is patient, ordinary human ingenuity, the kind of accumulated skill that gets lost from the written record, because skill doesn't always get written down, only results do. Maybe some of these numbers are pattern matching, the same way you can find shapes in clouds if you stare long enough. Or maybe there's a genuine gap in what we think we know about how much a very old civilization was capable of. And the honest answer is that we don't fully know yet. What's clear is that the questions raised by looking at the Great Pyramid purely through its measurements, without the comfort of the familiar story wrapped around them, don't dissolve the moment you look away. They're sitting in the stone right now, the same way they have for 45 centuries, waiting for whoever looks closely enough to notice. So here's the actual question worth sitting with. When the precision of something outruns every practical reason anyone can offer for it, what do you do with that gap? Do you assume it will eventually be explained by something ordinary we simply haven't found yet, a technique, a tool, a piece of knowledge since lost? Or do you let it stay open, an honest, unanswered question rather than a mystery dressed up with a premature answer? The stones aren't going anywhere. Neither is the argument.